Hey, what is going on, everyone? It's me, Mr. Mario, or, well, I guess for this time around I can call myself Mr. Mario. I'm sorry, I had to do it, alright? Look, it's on the tin right there. It's in the name of the product. I had to do this. I had to take the opportunity to do this, right? But either way, this is Mr. Mario here, and we're going to be doing a little bit of a review, overview, and I guess giving you all my thoughts over the MiSTerFPGA project. Now, to be clear, this project is not anything new. It's actually been around for several years, and it's really come a long way, and you all can probably tell from the title, if this isn't spoiling it enough, I think this thing is quite neat, to say the least. Now, I want to give a little bit of my background and introduction into the world of the MiSTerFPGA project. Originally, this actually all started for me on Twitter. You see, there were a lot of people that I was following who were in the world of retro video game console modding, whether this was modding them, upgrading them, what have you on there, and I kept noticing this word in threads that was being thrown around consistently. MiSTer. I started to look into this a bit, and there was even people who were going as far as saying that, yes, they do like to have the original bare metal hardware. They like to upgrade it. They like to run it through upscalers. They do like to have their original cartridges, like you can see right here, but what they typically do is they find themselves more and more often now, they have the original hardware, they have the cartridges, they put the cartridge on a shelf, and they end up playing it on a MiSTer. And these are people who, they are pretty pure with, again, wanting to play the original games on the original hardware. So I'm thinking, what the heck is this thing that people keep talking about? This began my search for the MiSTer project, and it led me to get in contact with Porkchop Express, and I gave him a follow, and we had been talking a bit. Now, Porkchop Express is the owner and operator of the MiSTer add-on site, which in my opinion is the best place and really your one-stop shop for getting, well, MiSTer add-ons. I mean, it's right there in the name. It works here pretty well. Now, I was looking into building one of these myself. I had all the money ready to go. I had pretty much my build sorted out. And then him and I were talking, Porkchop Express and we were talking, and then we ended up figuring out, what build of mine to get. He even helped me edit the build a little bit to make it a little bit better at the time. And on top of that, he actually ended up sending this over to me for free, mostly for review purposes here, which I am disclosing to you all. So really what I had to do was I ended up purchasing the DE10-Nano computer from him that is in here, and he provided all the other add-ons, including the case itself here, assembled it, and shipped the rest of it over for free for purposes of this review right here. So again, I do want to disclose that, but also give a huge shout out and thank you to Porkchop Express over from MiSTer Add-ons for providing most of the hardware here for review and for me to check out and enjoy. This is not a sponsored video. This is not swaying my opinion on the topic here. I think I'm going to make that pretty clear as well too once I really get into all of this. But again, I do want to give a huge shout out and thank you, because without him, this video wouldn't have been possible. And to you, dude, Porkchop, I am sorry this video has taken so long to make, to finally get out there, but we're here. We're finally here. We're going to be reviewing the MiSTer. Now, some of you all might be wondering, all right, you've been talking about this, you've been introducing it. What the heck is the MiSTer? And I figured the best way to explain it is actually just quoting directly from the MiSTer Wiki GitHub page. It states, MiSTer is an open project that aims to recreate various classic computers, game consoles, and arcade machines using modern hardware. It allows software and game images to run as they would on original hardware, using peripherals such as mice, keyboards, joysticks, and other game controllers. So the MiSTer itself uses an existing off-the-shelf system-on-chip FPGA development board called the DE10-Nano. Much like how RetroPie, if you have one of these set up here, RetroPie on a Raspberry Pi uses really the Raspberry Pi single board computer to do what it accomplishes right here. I am going to be making some comparisons here because I think that's the most apt comparison that a lot of people can make here. So again, we're going to be talking about the MiSTerFPGA, but I am going to be comparing it to a Raspberry Pi running a RetroPie setup in this regard. However, let's get this out of the way. These are two different devices. Not only they look different, they feel different, they are completely separate computers here, but the way that these are utilized is completely separate. You see, the RetroPie ends up using software emulation. The MiSTerFPGA using the DE10-Nano uses hardware emulation. And I know some people might get tripped up over that word, the E word right there, emulation. In my opinion, it's fair to describe it as that right there, as long as you're saying it's hardware emulation. You see, regardless of which option you're using here for some of the most well-known single board computers, such as a RetroPie on the Raspberry Pi, or even a commercial option such as the Nintendo Classic or even the Super Nintendo Classic, these can all have fantastic emulation, mind you. I'm not knocking that. However, they are using software emulation, where you are recreating the original hardware all in software. That is the huge difference right here when it comes to these consoles and something such as the MiSTerFPGA. Not only you're squeezing more consoles into it and out of it, but the consoles are recreated at a hardware level, and they are being emulated at a hardware level, which is why I'm calling this here hardware emulation, for lack of a better term. Now, to be clear, when you're using the MiSTer, every single console that is being utilized on this is called a core. Each core is being replicated using the DE10-Nano's field programmable gate array, FPGA for short. This to me is really cool, and in layman's terms, this is essentially allowing you to take computers, like old vintage computers, old arcade boards, and even game consoles, and as opposed to using a software emulation setup on them, it is taking them and it is completely rebuilding them to work just bare metal on the actual hardware right here that is within this. So it is really just building them to a new spec, and it is replicating what is being done there, and it's fantastic. I love to see it. In short, it's kind of like saying, hey, what if we took the original PlayStation right here, and instead of actually building out and manufacturing one of these here, what if we just ended up building it out specifically for this hardware? That's essentially what's happening. This, in my opinion, is the best of both worlds, because you are not only able to play your old consoles, your old arcade boards, computers, and games, of course, on them using this newer hardware and keep it really cycle accurate and having the most accurate hardware emulation experience you can have right here. So not only you're really striving for accuracy in terms of everything, but you're also able to bring a whole new standard to it. So at this point, you're able to just play the ROM files if you want to. You can have this hooked up to your Wi-Fi. You're able to use wireless controllers if you want to. You can use different controllers easily if you want to do that. Of course, one of the most basic things is you have actual HDMI setup on here, so you don't have to worry about playing with those old games and consoles with old adapters and upscaling and all that, when you literally just plug in an HDMI cable right here and you're really good at that point. Now, if you've been hearing this acronym FPGA for these older consoles right here, this might sound a little bit familiar, and you might have heard of the company Analog, for example, and their offerings. They not only have worked on and recreated many older systems, but they also even have some real cool stuff, such as, well, another option here, the Analog Pocket. Now, a couple of their actual home hardware consoles that have been the most popular have been the Super NT for the Super Nintendo and the Mega SG for the Sega Genesis. And both of these consoles, the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis, have been rebuilt in these new clone systems for, and I say that lovingly, lack of a better term there, but they've been rebuilt using FPGA hardware. Now, this is not to say that Analog and the MiSTer project are sharing code, but what I'm trying to say here is the reason why Analog's projects are so awesome and so well done is because they are using FPGA hardware, much like what the MiSTer is using right here, except this is going to support many more consoles out the gate, and it's a whole big open source project. Now, I keep talking about these consoles that this support, so you might be wondering, what consoles does this support? Well, I'm going to give you all a list here, and I do want to keep in mind, this is not even a comprehensive list, and I think the best course of action as well too is going to be that at one point, if you're watching this video in the future, this list is going to be outdated, which is good because that means that there will be some new consoles that will be added onto this list. So many of the consoles that are available right now, but probably not all of them, are the Bally Astrocade, the Atari 2600, 5200, and 7800, the Atari Lynx, the BBC Bridge Companion, the Casio PV1000, the Fairchild Channel F, the ColecoVision, Game Gear, Game Boy Advance, Game Boy Color, Game Boy, Super Game Boy, Sega Genesis, Sega CD, Sega 32X, Sega Master System. There is a Sega Saturn Core, but that one is in development. Just keep that in mind. We also have the Sony PlayStation, Game & Watch, Intellivision, Neo Geo, Magnavox Odyssey 2, Nintendo 64. That one is in development as well too. Just Keep that in mind. Pokemon Mini, the original Nintendo Entertainment System, the Super Nintendo, the TurboGrafx 16 or PC Engine. This also includes the CD-ROM and Super CD-ROM add-ons as well in capability. Vectrex, the WonderSwan, and the WonderSwan Color. And again, that is a whole list of really wonderful consoles and options right there, but I'm not even sure if that is comprehensive. And again, if you're watching this in the future, there might be more consoles added to it, which is fantastic. In this video here, I am going to be focusing really all on the consoles. This does not even include the arcade boards, the arcade games that you can play on here. Like, as opposed to having an actual arcade cabinet or arcade board, remember, like, take the arcade board, you are rebuilding that board to work at a hardware level on this. And from what I've seen, it's awesome. But I myself, I don't really pursue old vintage computers like that. I don't really pursue arcade emulation, arcade boards. I really just care about the consoles. But do keep in mind, you can look at all of the supported arcade cores and computer cores that are available on here. I'm really only covering like a third of the options that you can get out of this thing. So if you want to tackle MiSTerFPGA yourself, what do you need to jump into this? Well, of course, you're going to need the DE10-Nano development board. You're also going to need a power supply for it and a micro SD card. Those are going to be the bare minimum things you're going to need in order to just run the actual software on here. But you're also going to need a USB on-the-go cable and a USB hub of some kind. Although these are optional, I did get a fully loaded MiSTer of sorts, because you can see right here, I do have the actual board in there, but then I also have a board to connect everything, and I'm able to plug in a lot more USB ports all over this. Now, the parts I got for my setup were, of course, the DE10-Nano. I also got a 128 megabyte SD RAM module. I got an I/O board, a splitter with a switch for my power supply, a Bluetooth adapter, and a case. Now, I have one of these older cases right here, which is just fine, but as you can see, it has active cooling. So the only downside with this is that the fan does run on here, and you are going to be hearing the fan. It is going to make a bit of noise. However, for the last few years, there's been a really awesome case that is also from MiSTer Add-ons, which is completely really just like, it's aluminum, it's one piece, and it does passive cooling. It seemed to work incredibly well, and that is definitely the case that you're going to want to tackle and get. I just have an older case on mine. I also then took the 8GB micro SD card that was in here, and I upgraded it with my own micro SD card because, hey, I wanted to put a bunch of games on it. Now, the scariest thing about getting a MiSTer setup in this order, I would say, is probably, first of all, deciding on a build, because there's so many options out there. Next up is going to be the price. You're probably going to have to budget for one of these. Finally is going to be the software setup. So let's tackle each of these bit by bit here. For building, I believe this is essentially like building your own computer in a way, and I think having more options is better because you can really tailor this to your own solution, and you can choose how much or how little you want to spend on this. Although I do understand there are people who they're going to be overwhelmed by this aspect and they might not want to think about this as much, so thankfully there are pre-configured options that you can purchase out there, such as some pre-configured builds from MiSTer Add-ons where he has everything all ready to go for the specific build. So you might want to go with one of those options. Now, the price is also really steep on these things, and I'll tell you, when I was first looking to get a MiSTer project right here, I was kind of half joking, but I really wasn't. You see, for this console generation, the 9th generation of consoles, I really wasn't excited to get a console. So at the time, I was kind of half joking with friends where I was like, yeah, you know, I'm probably just going to take the money that I would spend on a PS5 or a Xbox Series X, and instead of getting one of those right off the bat, I'd rather just put that money towards a MiSTer because it's going to cost about as much as a brand new 9th generation system, but this one I'm actually excited for, and I'm going to get more usage out of it, I feel like, as opposed to one of the newer systems coming out that I'm not as excited for. Although the systems are not even as new now at this point, so many years removed, whether we like to think about it or not. The way I look at it when it comes to budgeting and price here is something like this. I've previously mentioned Analog's offerings, which are the Super NT and the Mega SG, which would be for the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis, respectively. And these, I would say, are the best clone consoles for both of those consoles out there right now. And while they're not original hardware, they are fantastic and excellent alternatives. And they're so good, in fact, that let's say if I was wanting to have a classic game night just by myself or with some friends or what have you, as opposed to hooking up a Super Nintendo and getting, you know, let's say component cables or even RGB SCART cables for it and getting an upscaler and upscaling it to my TV, or doing the same thing with a Sega Genesis, as opposed to getting one of those older systems, I would more reach for the analog options, which would be the Super NT or the Mega SG, because at that point you are getting a better right out of the box experience. You take the console, you plug it into power, you plug HDMI into it, it does the rest of everything for you, thanks to the awesome power of FPGA. And I'm really not trying to show for analog here, because again, this is a whole MiSTer thing, but I'm just trying to make this comparison because analog is probably one of the bigger, if not the biggest, retro gaming related company releasing consoles on FPGA hardware. And I'll say this, if you truly love one of those systems, like you absolutely love the Sega Genesis or you absolutely love the Super Nintendo, in that regard, it would be fine and it would be cheaper to buy one of those consoles. But if you're going to buy both of those consoles or even more, at that point, in my opinion, you might want to look towards getting a MiSTerFPGA. And by the way, this is said as someone who I own both of those systems, and I own a MiSTerFPGA. I'm speaking from experience right here. And the reason why I say that is because whether you're getting one of those actual standalone consoles or you're getting a MiSTerFPGA, at the heart of it all, it is using a FPGA, it is using FPGA technology to accomplish what is possible on a hardware emulation setup. And really, you're just using different hardware right here, except with this, you don't have to jailbreak it, you don't have to worry about any of the other stuff, and you have a lot more support and options when it comes to the MiSTer setup. Now, let's say I have convinced you, right? Let's say you ended up building out your options for your own MiSTerFPGA setup, or you end up buying a pre-configured option, you end up putting down the money, you decide to pay for everything. Finally, it's going to be the actual software setup. That's going to be super difficult, right? Well, it looks scary, but what if I told you the setup is really not difficult? Now, I kind of want to dispel this myth right here because, in my opinion, it's a myth. I've seen and I've heard a lot of people say, oh, you know, setting up a RetroPie with a Raspberry Pi, it's going to be so much easier. It is definitely a great route to go through everything, and everything just works super well on there, right? And if you're going to go with a MiSTer setup, it's so much more difficult. It's so much harder to do. And in my opinion, if you're saying that, you're kind of insulting your own intelligence at that point. Because I've tried the both of these here, and I can confidently say I firmly believe if you can set up and use and operate a RetroPie setup, you can easily set up and use and operate a MiSTerFPGA setup. It's not that it's harder, it's just going to be a little bit different. Really, all you need is you're going to need, of course, the actual hardware right here. You're going to need a computer to actually take your micro SD card and adapt it to the computer and download the files and put everything on there. And there is a lovely, simple to use script that you can set up on there. In fact, I'm actually just going to show you all how to do it here and how to get a basic setup of MiSTerFPGA going. This setup will be pretty basic, but I'm going to show you all how you can take a micro SD card, get it formatted, get the actual MiSTer OS on there, and then put a few games on here. Do keep in mind for some systems, such as the PlayStation, you're going to need to add extra BIOS in some places and all that fun stuff. I'm not going to be covering that, we're just going to do it at a basic level, but again, this is really just to show you all how simple this is. I'm going to be using the setup guide from the MiSTer wiki, so if you do need to follow along with anything written on here, it will be linked down below in the description, of course. Now, if we're using the MiSTer Fusion installation method, there's going to be two downloads that you're going to need. The first is going to be the latest MiSTer Fusion image download. You're just going to find it over on the releases for this and download the zip file, just the latest one, somewhere you can easily find it. Next up, you can use a disk image utility such as the Apple Pi Baker, Balena Etcher, or Win32 Disk Imager. Does not matter as long as it gets the job done. For this, I'm going to use Balena's Etcher, so I'll go ahead and download this. And I'm just going to grab the portable version here for Windows. Probably the most difficult thing to this setup process here is going to be getting your micro SD card adapted to your computer. So as long as you have a way of connecting a micro SD card to your PC, you're good to go at that point. Mine is going to be drive letter H, so keep that in mind. And if there's any data you care about, you're going to want to back it up right now because it's all going to be destroyed. From here, you're going to take the latest Fusion image, right-click this, and extract it using something such as 7-zip. Just extract it right there. It'll give you this .img file. That's exactly what we need. Next up, we can now open up Balena Etcher or whatever program we're using. Thankfully, Etcher is pretty simple to use. I'm going to grab the image file and drop it on here. Next, we're going to select the target. So this one is going to be my H drive, which I definitely know is my micro SD card. I'm going to select that and flash. It did bring this up here, and I'm going to say yes to this. And there we go, we're off to the races. So we're just going to let this do its own thing. Now, from what I understand, this requires at least a 2GB micro SD card, so you're probably going to have to struggle to find one that small. For this demonstration, I'm just using an 8GB because that's really all I need. Once it's done that, it's going to validate it, let it do that real quick, and once this is all done, I mean, we're good to go at this point. We've done the entire OS setup. Now, it's saying that my flash has failed right here. I'm not too concerned with it just because I know that this kind of formats everything in a certain way. So I'm just going to really trust the process here. I know that the image did flash over, but I'm going to close out of this. I'll take my USB drive. I'm going to eject it here. And now we can physically unplug it, and we're going to plug it into our DE10-Nano and power it. And of course, hook it up to a TV. And here we go. Once you plug in your micro SD card and then turn on your MiSTer in that order, you'll know that this is doing something successfully because you're going to get a screen like this saying that MiSTer Fusion is installing MiSTer and please stand by. I'll also say if you're intending to hook this up to your network, if you're going to use a hardline internet connection, just go ahead and take your Ethernet cable and pop it into your port and plug that in. If you're going to be using Wi-Fi, that's fine, you can set that up later. I personally do this on a wired connection, but whatever you're doing here, we're going to get it working. Now you'll know that worked because after no more than 2 minutes, your MiSTer should restart and bring you to this screen right here. And if you're here, don't worry, nothing is broken. You should actually congratulate yourself because MiSTer OS has been installed. At this point, you are going to need a USB keyboard. So go ahead, plug one in, or if you're using a wireless one, you might want a USB dongle or whatever you're using here. Go ahead, plug in a keyboard and tap the F12 key. You're going to come right here and come over to scripts and tap the enter key. It's going to give you this warning here. Go ahead and say yes, or you could say yes and don't ask again. Now at this point, if you want to set up your Wi-Fi connection, you can certainly do that right here within the Wi-Fi script. I'm not going to be doing that because I have mine connected to the internet already, but if you're doing wireless, you're going to want to run the Wi-Fi script. Once you've run that Wi-Fi script successfully, you're going to come over to update and tap enter. And it's going to go through this whole process right here. There's really not too much else for you to do right here in terms of input. You're just going to want to let the update script run and do its own thing. And as you can see right here, it's pulling down a whole lot of zips, and it's going to pull down a whole lot more that we're going to need to get MiSTer running as nice as we want it to. Do keep in mind here, as this is all unpacking, we can see several of the cores, for example, Game Boy Advance, Genesis, Nintendo Entertainment System, PSX, or PS1. This is all pulling the ones from the main branch, like the cores, and these are the stable cores. So if you're wanting to mess around with something that is more experimental, you're either going to have to compile it yourself and load the core on there manually, or you're going to have to go with another branch that does have more experimental ones. That's something that you can more explore on your own here, but this is really just covering the stock basic setup. It actually even shows everything within the guide itself if you scroll down, so if you ever want to update the MiSTer files or really just put your own, not only that, this is the actual OS update, but also getting the cores manually. If you want to get a specific one or really just have to compile one yourself, it shows exactly what you need to do right here, so everything is great in this regard. And hey, have you ever wanted cheats? Well, guess what? You're going to get a lot of cheats here. You're going to get a whole lot of cheats. So there we go. As you can see, we're at the end here. Now, I've cut forward. It's taken just under 15 minutes to run this script, but once it's all done, it should automatically reboot. Just let it do its thing. Now, once we reboot, we should get a little something like this, and as you can see, we are all good to go, and we have several other options here. So you can check and see, we have all of these arcade cores right here. We can go down to computer, we have all the computer cores, we can go over to console, and this is what we were really wanting to go after. We have all the console cores that are available. You can also go into other, check these out right here, and you can go into utility, adjust the utilities, all that fun stuff. Now, I'm also going to show you all how to set up a controller real quick. If you just have a USB controller, you can plug it in, but if you're going to be using a Bluetooth controller like me, you're still going to need your keyboard here for the initial setup, but let's go ahead and get this all synced up. I do have a Bluetooth USB adapter plugged in, so you will need that, but on the main MiSTer page, you're going to hit the F11 key on your keyboard, and it's now going to switch into Bluetooth pairing mode. So it's going to start searching. At this point, go ahead and get your controller into pairing mode. Mine is a Pro controller right here, and as you can see, it is done. So now my controller, I'm going to press A, and there we go. I'm now able to use my actual controller on here, which is my Switch Pro controller. So that's great. That's how you can sync up a controller. And now that we're done with that, as long as you're comfortable using a controller, you can now disconnect your USB keyboard. So now we need to get our games over. What you can do is, if you're using a Pro controller like me, press the B button or press escape on your keyboard. Once you come over to this screen here, you're going to have remap keyboard, joystick buttons if you need to do that. You'll also have additional scripts right here that you can check out. I'm just going to say yes, don't ask again, and change all of this here if you need to do that. I don't care about that though, so at this screen I'm going to tap the left button on my D-pad, and you can see that there is an IP address, and there's two ways that we can transfer games over to our MiSTer. So I'll show you FTP and USB in that order. First of all, if we're using FTP, make sure you have your IP address shown right here, and then keep your MiSTer on and running. To connect over to the MiSTer using FTP, you can use whatever your favorite FTP client is. I'm going to use WinSCP for this. Go ahead, go over, create a new connection here. To set up a new one, we're going to do FTP. Here you're going to use no encryption. Enter in that IP address for the host name. Port number 21 is fine. And then for your username, it's going to be root. And for your password, it's going to be numeral 1. And that's it. And if you want to save it, you can. Now you can click on login. And as you can see, you should be able to be connected to your MiSTer. Now, if you're here in the root directory, you'll probably have to double tap this up here to come out one. Then you're going to need to look for where to transfer all your games. For that, you're going to go to Media, FAT, and inside of here, you're going to look for Games, and then you're going to add your games into your respective directories. So these are all pretty self-explanatory, but for example, if you want to put a game for Game Boy, you put it in the Game Boy directory. Game Boy Advance games go into GBA. Game Gear goes into Game Gear. Famicom or Nintendo would go into NES. Super Nintendo or Super Famicom would go into SNES. So this is all pretty self-explanatory. You just go into each of these directories and transfer your games over. However, let's say you have a whole bunch of files you want to transfer over, or especially some really big ones, such as, let's say, PC Engine, CD-ROMs, or PS1 games. It might be better to transfer these over through USB. So for that, we're actually going to go back over to the MiSTer and turn it off so we can unplug the micro SD card. Remember, I told you all trust the process here, and check it out. We have our MiSTer data card right here, and it extended it out and partitioned it accordingly. So let's enter the micro SD card. Inside of here, it's going to be the exact same setup, but you're going to want to go over to Games, and then inside of Games, you're going to transfer everything over. Now, I have 3 different games that I'm going to transfer over. So Sonic the Hedgehog 2 is for the Genesis or the Mega Drive. So sorry for all my folks across the pond, but we're going to have to use Genesis for this. Copy and paste it over, you're done. As for Game Boy Advance, we're going to look for GBA. Inside of here, copy and paste, you're done. Finally, we're going to need the Super Nintendo or Super Famicom. So we're going to come over, we're going to look for SNES. So for anybody, sorry if you're using the Super Famicom, you're going to look for SNES. Go in here, copy and paste this, and you're done. So those are the 3 games that I wanted to transfer over just for this demonstration. I'm going to right click and eject, and we're all good at that point. We can now take our micro SD card, pop it into the MiSTer, and turn it on in that order. Here we go, the MiSTer is up and running. Now to load up a game, we go over to console. Let's go ahead and find, Super Nintendo. How about that? So I'm going to go to SNES, open this core up, and it's going to bring up this menu right here. And at this point, you can change any of these settings here if you want to. You can navigate up and down. You can go left and right, of course. I'm going to keep everything as is. So I'm going to go to Load, and then find your game. Tap A, wait for it to load up. And as you can see here, after a few seconds, it's going to load up successfully. And now we have Star Fox up and running on here beautifully. If you do want to exit out of your games, at least with me using the Pro controller, I'm going to press the Home button. It's going to bring this menu back up. I'm going to go over here and go to the right. Now I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to tap Reboot. It's now going to bring me back over to MiSTer OS, and I can go down to Console. This time around, I'm going to load up Kingdom Hearts. How about that? So GBA, open this up, and once this opens, I'm going to press the Home button. Sometimes you'll have to do that. Go to Load GBA, tap this, wait for the ROM to load up, and once it ends up rebooting the core with that game loaded, we should be all good. Here we go. We have this working beautifully as well. The nice thing is, like I said, you are able to do a few extra things here. So you can do a save state on the Game Boy Advance core, but you really can't do that on all the other cores from what I've seen, unfortunately. You can also go into cheats, load up cheats, all that fun stuff here. That's about all there is to it. So there you go. We are at a pretty good spot. I've shown you all how to go from nothing to a MiSTer setup with games on it within, 20 minutes. Now that we've set this up, you all also might be wondering how games are really operating on here. So I'll give some examples of some things that I've tried out. Really older systems that I've played on, so really the 4th generation and lower, that's what this is really going to be optimized for. Think the Sega Genesis, the Super Nintendo, and even older, but there is some caveats to that. Really, when working on it, games have seemed to be fine for the most part. For example, I took the Famicom or Nintendo Entertainment System core. I played Rad Racer on there. It was great. Really little to no issues on that. Nothing I could really see. Super Nintendo games play phenomenally. They look absolutely beautiful. There is a ton of options that are in these cores as well too. I know some people might be wanting something such as save states on there, and while there are some auto-saving options in some ways, I've noticed, and it seems to be a limitation of the actual kind of nature of FPGA itself. When it comes to save states, you can really only do save states on the Game Boy Advance. So I did try some Game Boy Advance games, mainly Kingdom Hearts Chain of Memory, since I knew that this is a bit of a more intensive game with the FMVs on there, and it seemed to work just fine. So that's been good. Again, things like the Super Nintendo, the Sega Genesis, those have worked just fine. However, then you also get into some other systems as well, like the PC Engine, where I've had great experiences with that. Probably the one I've been the most excited for, I will say, and I really do say this with a smile on my face, is really just, I guess, first of all, any of these CD type systems, any of the optical drive based systems, and there are a few on here. Now, I've talked about how the PC Engine or the TurboGrafx 16, you do have the CD-ROM and Super CD-ROM compatibility on there. Now, I didn't grow up with these systems. I really didn't have any nostalgia for them, so I had to look into some other consoles as well. And one thing is, for example, with the Sega Genesis, you have not only the 32X setup, which is really nice because I don't want to deal with that mushroom cloud setup and all the cables and all that. I have a 32X. It is so annoying to get set up on there. So if I can just play my 32X games, even though they're not really that good, but if I can just play them on the MiSTer itself, that is great. ROM hacks on here, great as well too. There's been a few like ROM hacked or improved games that I've played on here, and they work just fine, just like you're running them on bare metal hardware with all the adaptions and everything, so you're able to upscale it beautifully. And I'm just using 1080p 60 on this here. However, when it comes down to the optical drive systems, I know, for example, the Sega CD, now I'm lucky, I ended up buying my Sega CD years ago at a thrift shop for like $12 with Sonic CD included. I know they are a lot more now, and also these are all things that you do have to maintain. Not only the discs themselves, it is recommended to back them up because they are dying, but also maintaining the actual hardware itself too. And when you do use this hardware, you are going to wear it down. So what we can do to protect our hardware is going to be really important. And as opposed to getting a Sega Genesis, getting a Sega CD, getting the games, then running it on the actual hardware itself, using adapters to upscale it and clean it up and run it at 1080p and everything, you can really just back up your games and then transfer them to the MiSTer and run them off of here, and you can use any type of controller you want. This might be a little sacrilegious right here, but the controller that I've been preferring has actually been a Nintendo Switch Pro controller right here. It works beautifully, it works great. If you have any other controllers you want, you can sync them up wirelessly, or if they're wired, you can use a ton of different adapters on this as well too. If you want to play Sega CD games with a 360 controller, feel free to do it. As long as you can adapt it, it works. If you want to play around with the experimental Sega Saturn core, go ahead and get yourself one of these Sega Saturn controllers. Like, this actually works on here, and it's wireless and all that stuff, so this works. If you want to play PlayStation games with this, I wouldn't, but do that. It'll work out just fine. However, when it comes to the Sega CD, it was really exciting that I was able to take my games, I was able to transfer them onto here, and I was able to play them with no issues on this, and they look beautiful, they play just fine, they sound fantastic, and that's not even the only optical drive system you can play on. I have mentioned 2 of them, but there's another 2 that also make me happy. There is a Sega Saturn core, which I really don't want to judge because the Sega Saturn and the N64 cores are currently in development, so I don't think it's fair to really judge them right now as they're in development. But one that was in development for a while and is now out and it's been stable and has made me very happy has been the PlayStation core. You can now take your PlayStation games and you can play them on the MiSTer. And oh my goodness, they are beautiful. You have cheats on there. You're able to load them up perfectly within the core. There's a whole bunch of options that you can mess around with on there. And even just playing them and experiencing them, it's fantastic. I've had a lot of fun because this is kind of the generation that gives me a whole lot of nostalgia right here. So playing around with PlayStation games on this has been really awesome. Did I buy one of these just to play PlayStation games? No. But is it something that was not available and then it was available later on? Yes. And that is the beauty of the MiSTer project, is that it's really just one of those systems that keeps on giving. So if you're one of those people, you've had a MiSTer for like 6 years, you've seen a lot more systems get added to this thing. Now, I even want to share a little bit of a personal anecdote when it comes to, I guess, showing how good the hardware emulation and the adaptation is on here. And that's actually, I'm bringing up the PlayStation here because this is something that I have more experience with, specifically with probably my all-time favorite canceled game, Thrill Kill. Absolutely love this game. This has done a whole lot for me getting into games and preservation and just betas, prototypes, all of that stuff right here, right? This is a game, look it up, really just quite literally a bloody, kind of disturbing game, but something really interesting for the original PlayStation that never officially came to be. Now, this is one of the games I end up trying out on the MiSTer, and the interesting thing about it is that this game, just in short, the way that the engine is built and handled on here, I'm sure now in 2023, totally fine, but there are still times you are going to run into, depending on the device, depending on the emulator, you're going to run into issues. In fact, this is a game I've run into issues with on both emulators and original hardware. You see, for the longest time, emulators could not handle this game properly. You would just run into issues mainly related to the CDDA tracks, so the audio tracks not playing on there, really long loading times, performance issues, just a lot of stuff, and it depended on the emulator and the settings you were using. So there was a lot of tweaking you had to do to get this running properly, but even on bare metal hardware. You see, since this game never officially came out, you really have to play on a modified PlayStation, or you have to do a swap trick. And when I was younger, I ended up doing a swap trick on here. Now, it was known that this game, if you did a swap trick on it, did not perform very well. And there were 3 telltale signs that you could look for on this. First of all, was the loading times were abysmal on it. Secondly, was the background audio, so the background music from the CDDA tracks on here would not play in-game. And third was when your character is going in for a thrill kill, before they get electrocuted, the game just keeps kind of soft freezing. So it's not a stable or smooth experience is what I'm saying. But as a kid, I was desperate to play this game. I end up overlooking all of that. So I was quite amazed when I end up firing this up here on the MiSTer project, and it played beautifully. Beautifully. It looked amazing because it was just piped through HDMI. It sounded great because, again, HDMI, and it played wonderfully. I had no issues loading. I had no issues with performance on here. I had 0 issues playing this game. And again, this is a game I know for a fact has given emulators and bare metal hardware a hard time. So the fact that I was able to play this perfectly on the MiSTer just, it showed to me how good the core is. Now, let's get into all the issues that the MiSTer has had, because this is probably a really grating experience, right? And, you know, there's actually not much to report here. I'm happy to say that using a MiSTer day-to-day is actually incredibly usable, and it's quite a nice experience. And while the project is open, it's free, it's open source, it's always being developed, improved upon, and there are updates that you will have to install on here, at least it's going to be recommended to do so. While that is all totally valid, I do also believe for anybody who has been waiting to get a MiSTer saying that, oh, the project needs more time to mature, those are people who just haven't used a MiSTer for themselves. When I initially finally got my setup up and running, it was during a holiday when I had some family over here. So I decided to grab my MiSTer, I set it all up, I put the games on there that I wanted to play. I then ended up hooking it up in my game room. And I was using it myself, but I also had my younger brothers who were acting as guinea pigs testing it out. And really, once I got the controllers synchronized, I told them how to turn on the MiSTer, how to use it, how to navigate it. So when I explained it to them one time, they might have had one or two questions after that, but aside from that, they were really excited to use this thing. They were able to use it with little to no issue, and there were so many times they ended up, I don't remember which game, but they ended up finishing one of the Mario games on here, and they were even asking, whenever they had, they weren't sure how to hook it up or something, they would ask hey, can you put the thing on the TV again? And I just went over, I turned it on and got the controller synced up, and it was able to work just fine. So what I'm saying is, whether you are a technical power user or you're just a casual user, as long as you actually learn how to navigate it, which you're going to have to do with any kind of multi-console device like this or emulation machine like this, you're good. Even when I ran into issues, I ended up finding out something beautiful. I found out that the MiSTerFPGA community is so welcoming, and they really just document things so well, and there's just such a lively community that pretty much anything you're going to look up, you're going to have an answer for. I'm going to tell you all about the most difficult issue that I ran into with this. At one point, I hadn't used my MiSTerFPGA setup in a long while, so I fired it up, I connected it to my network, and I tried to update this through the update script. Unfortunately, I ran into an issue saying that my actual MiSTer OS was so out of date that I had to do it manually. And I really didn't want to wipe my SD card because I have a bunch of games on here. So I looked up on Google, upgrade MiSTer OS in quotes, and I was able to find a thread covering exactly what I needed to on Google. I checked out the thread. There was actually really helpful folks there who ended up replying with another link to the exact place I needed to go. And then for me to fix this up without having to wipe and redo my entire setup, all I had to do was download the latest MiSTer update manually. I ended up extracting out the files. I copied, pasted, and overwrote what I needed to on here. I reset the MiSTer.ini file. Then I unplugged my micro SD card, put it back into the MiSTer, turned it on. That was it. I was done. That was the biggest and most difficult issue I ran into with the MiSTer. So what I'm saying here is, when it comes to something like this, think of it like a computer. Think of it like any other device like this. You are going to need some level of technical knowledge. You are going to need some form of Google foo that you will be exercising. However, again, if you've used a modified console, if you have built your own computer, if you have done troubleshooting issues in some degree, if you have used and had issues and tried to fix up things on a RetroPie setup, on a Raspberry Pi, if you have done that, you'll be just fine on the MiSTer setup. Now, the only consistent issue I've run into, which I'm not even saying this is going to really affect everyone here, but I'm more putting this in for transparency, is that I've had some issues with the HDMI output here, and really it's been when I hook this up through HDMI to my main TV in my game room, I noticed that the signal will just keep flickering and I'm not able to keep it stable. And out of all the devices, all the consoles, everything that I've owned that I've hooked up to that TV, the only other system I've had this issue with has been my original Xbox that's been modded with the Xbox HD Plus. Occasionally I've run into this. However, even that's been resolved, and I noticed that this kind of flickering HDMI signal has been worse on the MiSTer compared to any other device that I've had. However, I did end up finding a fix, and this is to inform you all of this. This is also, your mileage may vary, and for me, this is how it affected me. But I just noticed that it only happened whenever I hooked this thing up to a HDMI splitter. So that is my long, short way of saying I was running into HDMI issues, and I believe my HDMI issues were from using an HDMI splitter. So if you're connecting this up to your HDMI display and it's just having all these issues displaying and all that, and the signal keeps flickering, you might want to check and see if you're using a splitter in your setup, and if you can, just connect it directly to your screen. So let's get into final thoughts. Overall, I'm going to say the MiSTer is an incredible project, and this is now my preferred method of playing these older games. Yes, we do have computers with beautiful emulation options. We do have even commercial products. Not only we have, of course, homebrewed projects like the RetroPie, but we even have commercial projects such as the Nintendo and Super Nintendo Classic, and you can even modify these to get some more mileage out of them. So in the last few years, there's been a real big love, officially and unofficially, and a lot more support for emulation, which I think is always a good thing. I do like to mess around with original hardware, don't get me wrong, but I am not against emulation. I think emulation is fantastic, so that's really cool to see. And we even have stuff such as the Steam Deck and using EmuDeck on there, and you can play your games on there just fine. However, I will say, I don't know, there's something I really like about just having a little cute box like this, like one of these things where you just plug it in and you have everything all ready to go right off the bat, as opposed to having it on another console or having it on a computer or what have you. I do like that. It's just this little thing. You can throw it in your backpack, you can throw it in your bag, you can connect it wherever you want to, as long as you have HDMI and power and all that, and you're good to go. I think there's something great about this. But I will say there's also something missing if you're going to use, hardware like this. There's something missing to actually taking the real hardware itself and plugging these into an actual console and playing them off there. I think it's something I can't even fully explain it. I think it's kind of just like some kind of like primal urge that we have, but there's some people who just absolutely love that, and I'm one of those people as well too. Like, I would love to, even though I do talk about backing up and preserving your content, there's also times I do really like to be able to pull something off the shelf and actually pop it into a disk drive or a cartridge slot or what have you and play it directly from there. I really like that. And that is one thing, when you're using the MiSTer, you end up missing out on the feels of this, right? It's going to be similar to loading up a flash cart on your favorite console. Now, let's not kid ourselves here. This thing is expensive. I haven't tried to beat around the bush on that. This thing is expensive. However, I'm going to ask you all, have you all seen some of the prices for modifying original hardware on here? Even if you just do a quick glance at what is out there, even if you take a system, let's say again the Sega Genesis, that doesn't even need to be modified, really if you're going to take the Sega Genesis and hook it up directly to a flat screen like modern day, like let's say a 4K OLED display in composite, you might not even be able to, but secondly, it's really not going to look good, so you're going to want to get a more modern display on there. You could use something like RGB SCART or component using the respective cables, but then you're also probably going to need to adapt that to HDMI, and even then you're going to want to get a good HDMI scaler that's going to handle and clean up a lot of this. So really the price adds up to everything here. And if you get a good scaler such as, let's say, the RetroTink 5X, and this is absolutely no knock to it, it is an expensive device. You are going to have to get the cables, you are going to have to get the consoles, you are going to have to modify some of those consoles as well, especially if, let's say, you don't even want to go the upscaler route, you just want to get HDMI directly into the system itself. You're going to have to do all of that. And what I'm saying is, yeah, you can use one adapter for many systems, but it's still, I guess, upscaler, but it's still going to be pretty expensive. Let's even, again, Sega Genesis, I'm taking this. Let's say you buy a Sega Genesis, you get the controllers, you get the cable needed. Then you purchase a RGB SCART cable, a good one, or a component cable, again, a good one. Then you end up getting some kind of SCART or component to HDMI adapter, an upscaler such as the RetroTink 5X. And you know what? Just because we are able to load up all of our games in one place, let's do the same thing here. Let's go ahead and get a flash cart for the Sega Genesis and pop it in. You're going to have the same functionality on there, but you're really going to be limited to just that system right there. And this is all well and good for one system, maybe two systems, unless you just want to do it on all of your systems. But again, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just going to get really, really expensive. And it's kind of nice that you can just have everything right here. You have all the games, all the consoles right here, and you don't have to worry about getting a whole bunch of adapters, upscalers, or any of that, because again, HDMI, you just have HDMI right there. And what if this is a system that you have to modify? Like, let's say the Nintendo 64, where at least the North American versions, you have to modify them to get RGB output out of them to properly make use of a RGB SCART cable or a component cable. So you're going to have to do a modification on that, and they could be really inexpensive or quite expensive depending on what you're going to be doing there. That's also going to require you to have the know-how to actually solder, or you're going to have to find someone to do that. You're going to have to get all the parts, and you just do you see how all of this adds up here? I hope I'm really painting a vivid picture for you all. But I will also say, as someone who has done several of those modifications, I have systems like that, I have upscalers and all that. I could also see shoe on the other foot, because I'm wearing both shoes at this point. You could say they're mismatching. I really do like the ability of having everything right here in one place, hardware accurately emulated and just available quite literally in the palm of my hand. That is really nice, but at the same time, I also understand getting the satisfaction out of taking something apart, refurbishing it, rebuilding it, modifying it, improving it, pulling the best you can out of that old box that you can get. I understand there's something to that. And of course, like I said, being able to take your old cartridges and actually plop them into the console. That's super cool. However, once you have it dialed in, and of course, once you spend a good chunk of change, the MiSTer will be as simple or as complex as you want it to be. And it could be a minimal setup, or you can have all the bells and whistles on here like I'm pretty sure I do right here. Once it's all dialed in, I have no complaints at this point here. My wish list from this for the longest time was actually a PlayStation Core, but guess what? We got it. We're able to play our PlayStation games. Of course, you can't play them directly from the CD on here, but that's why, again, you take your games, pop them into your computer. You're going to have to get an optical drive, but pop them into your computer, rip them over, transfer the ISOs over to the MiSTer itself. You're able to play them at that point. You're able to keep your CD on a shelf in your collection. You're not wearing down your laser on your original PlayStation, and you have an amazing option right here when you are playing your games. This thing, I'm sure, can be as beautiful as getting like an HDMI modded PlayStation 1 and playing your games through that. That's super awesome. Either way, my wish list doesn't need to be fulfilled because it's already been fulfilled. I really wanted a PlayStation 1 core. We end up getting a beautiful PlayStation 1 core on here. We're also getting, for those who are willing to wait and they really want to keep up to date on here, there's a N64 core in development and there's a Sega Saturn core in development. So really, when it comes down to my recommendations, what do I recommend here? If you are wanting something that can play your 4th generation games, and now we're seeing 5th generation since you can play PlayStation, and it looks like N64 is coming along and Saturn is also coming along, although you're going to have to wait on there. But for the most part, as long as you're willing to wait a little bit on those ones, but you really care about having your classic arcade boards, old computers, and especially 4th generation and lower game consoles on here, if you are wanting to play those in the most accurate, emulated way possible and also have a whole lot of convenience right here, yeah, the MiSTerFPGA is going to be for you. This is what you're going to want to gun after. I don't really have too much to say about this here, although, I mean, this is probably going to be well over an hour in length. But the point is, at the end here, I don't have too much else to say. Even the review itself here for this, it really kind of just wrote itself in a way. Because this device is so great that I didn't really have much bad to say about it. I'm just singing its praises. Like, I love this thing. MiSTerFPGA is awesome. The MiSTer project is awesome. And I'll say it's been an absolute pleasure to not only review this thing, but even just utilize it, play it, have fun with it, tinker with it. Like, I don't have enough good things to say about this. I can constantly sing its praises, but we do need to wrap this video up here. I will say, if this has interested you, if you are interested in getting one of these, first of all, probably start budgeting and saving your money a little bit, because this is not a cheap device, as I have been pretty transparent about here. But secondly, I would also recommend going over to the MiSTer add-on site, which will be linked down below in the description, and grabbing one of these from Porkchop Express. Not only he does fantastic business, and he provided this for review, at least all the other components, the add-ons and the case and everything for review, which I do want to thank you. Big shout out and thank you again to Porkchop Express for this. But on top of this, the developments that he has been helping with within the MiSTerFPGA community have been absolutely awesome. So if you want to support someone pretty awesome to keep this project going, he would be a good person to go with. And, you know, when you're supporting him, might as well get one of these setups here, right? I really can't recommend this thing enough. This thing is great. Anyways, that is about it for this review here. I hope you all enjoyed it. I hope it helped out. I hope you all had some fun checking this all out here. This is about it for this video here. This is Mr. Mario signing off. Thank you all for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, a like would absolutely be appreciated. If you didn't like it, a dislike is fine as well, too.